There are performers whose lives seem to divide neatly into two halves, the difficult years before success and the comfortable years after it. Marti Caine was not one of them. Her life never became that simple. She was born into wartime Sheffield. Her father died when she was still a child. Her family life fractured. She spent part of her childhood in local authority care. She later spoke and wrote about experiences no child should have had to endure. She married at 17, became a mother while still almost a child herself, and entered the working men's clubs not because fame was calling, but because there was a funeral bill she could not afford to pay. Then came the years of smoke-filled clubs, hecklers, cheap dressing rooms and long drives home. More than a decade of learning how to hold an audience that did not care about ambition, only about whether the person on stage could make them laugh. Eventually, Britain noticed. In 1975, after years of being almost unknown outside the northern club circuit, Marti Caine won new faces. Within a few years, she had her own BBC television show, was appearing before the royal family, and had become one of the rare women in British entertainment who could carry an entire programme on her own name. But success brought no clean escape from the past. Her first marriage ended. One of the biggest professional decisions of her career placed her at the centre of an international political controversy. In the 1980s, she returned to New Faces, this time not as the frightened contestant waiting to be judged, but as the woman standing at the centre of the stage. And then, when she seemed to have finally outrun the worst of what life had thrown at her, came the diagnosis: cancer. Marti Caine responded in the only language she had trusted all her life. She made a joke. When told she had lymphoma, she famously asked whether that made her a lymphomaniac. The joke was pure Marti, but the illness was not. For years she fought it, worked through it, wrote about it, lost her hair to treatment, returned to the stage, faced television cameras, and refused to let the public see only a dying woman. In 1994, British television celebrated her life on This Is Your Life. In 1995, she was still appearing on screen. Then, on the 4th of November, 1995, Marti Caine died at her home in Henley-on-Thames. She was 50 years old, not 70, not 80, 50. That number changes the shape of the story. The glamorous television star, the club comic, the singer, the actress, the mother, the controversial celebrity, the woman who turned fear itself into material for laughter, had been given only half a century. This is not simply the story of a famous comedian who died young. It is the story of Lynne Denise Shepherd, who survived one life, invented another, and spent both of them refusing to surrender quietly. This is the tragic life of Marti Caine. Lynne Denise Shepherd was born on the 26th of January, 1945, in Sheffield. The war in Europe was still being fought. Victory in Europe Day was more than 3 months away, and the steel city into which she arrived had already spent years living with wartime production, blackout, shortages, and exhaustion. Sheffield was a city built around heavy industry, steel, and labour. For a child born into a working-class family, there was nothing inevitable about entering show business. There were no theatrical connections waiting to be used, no family fortune capable of buying time for dreams, and no obvious bridge between the streets of Sheffield and national television. The first great rupture in Lynne's life came early. Her father died from cancer when she was 7 years old. For any child, the death of a parent rearranges the world. In Lynne's case, the loss was followed by further instability. Contemporary accounts of her life describe her mother as struggling badly after her husband's death, turning increasingly to alcohol and drugs. By the time Lynne was 9, her mother had placed her in the care of the local authorities. The details become darker still. Marti Caine later spoke and wrote about sexual abuse by her paternal grandfather during childhood. It was not a decorative tragedy added years later to make a celebrity story more dramatic. By her own later account, the experience had consequences that reached far into her adolescence and adult life. She became rebellious, angry, determined to escape control wherever she found it. There is a temptation, when telling the life of a comedian, to search childhood for the moment when laughter began. But in Marti's case, something more important was forming first, the instinct to survive by changing the terms of the situation. If life could humiliate you, make the humiliation yours before somebody else did. If people could judge your appearance, joke about it first. If fear entered the room, give it a name, exaggerate it, make the audience laugh at it. Long before she became famous for self-deprecating comedy, the emotional machinery behind that comedy was already being assembled. Her mother remained another complicated presence in the story. Accounts of Marti's early life describe a relationship marked by love, instability, separation, and pain. Her mother later died after a long period of personal struggle. Whatever simplifications television fame would eventually impose on Marti Caine, her childhood did not offer simple villains and heroes. It offered loss, damage, dependence, and the kind of emotional contradictions children often carry into adulthood without ever fully resolving them. At 17, Lynne made her escape in the most immediate way available to her. In 1962, she married Malcolm Stringer, a young man from the same working-class world. She became a wife while still a teenager and soon became a mother. Their sons, Lee and Max, arrived while the ambitions she carried had little room to breathe. She had once been an ex-beauty queen with dreams of something larger, but dreams did not pay household bills. Marriage, babies, and limited money had narrowed the possibilities quickly. To anyone looking from the outside, Lynne Stringer could easily have disappeared into the ordinary life expected of thousands of young women from similar backgrounds. But the story had already taught her one lesson. Ordinary life was not safe simply because it was ordinary, and when another crisis arrived, it would push her toward the stage for reasons far less glamorous than ambition. The beginning of Marti Caine's professional life was not a romantic story about being discovered. It began with debt. After her mother's death, Lynne was left facing funeral expenses reported at £150. For a young mother with 2 children and very little money, it was a serious burden. The person who would one day headline television shows and stand before royal audiences needed cash, and she needed it immediately. The solution was the Northern Club circuit. She auditioned at the Chapeltown Working Men's Club outside Sheffield. She was not yet Marti Caine. She was Lynne Stringer, nervous, inexperienced, and stepping into a world that could be unforgiving even to performers who had spent years preparing for it. The working men's clubs of the 1960s were not finishing schools for fragile egos. Audiences talked, drank, smoked, interrupted, and heckled. A performer who failed could discover the fact instantly and publicly. There was no editing room, no second take, and no carefully managed television audience waiting to applaud on instruction. At first, Lynne thought of herself primarily as a singer. That did not last. She discovered that laughter came more naturally. A tall, glamorous young woman delivering stand-up in northern working men's clubs was unusual enough to make audiences look up. Once she had their attention, she learned how to keep it. The stage name took several attempts. For a brief time, she performed as Sunny Smith. Then came Zoe Bond. Neither felt right. Eventually, she and Malcolm searched for something better, and the unlikely answer came from the language of gardening. A tomato cane helped inspire the proposed name Marti Caine. Then show business performed one of its smallest accidents. A club misheard or misspelled the name. Marti Caine appeared on the bill, and Marti Caine stayed. The name sounded sharper than Lynne Stringer. It looked like it belonged in lights. But the woman carrying it still had to earn every room. She developed the act piece by piece. Her thin figure became material. Her face became material. Her insecurity became material. She learned that the most efficient defense against a cruel audience was often to reach the joke before they did. If somebody was going to mention her body, her nose, her clothes, or her awkwardness, Marti could make the observation first and make it funnier. That technique can look simple when a master uses it. It is not. Self-deprecation fails if the audience senses genuine self-pity. It becomes uncomfortable if the performer appears to be asking for reassurance. Marti's gift was that she could turn apparent vulnerability into control. She did not merely allow the audience to laugh at her. She decided what they would laugh at, when they would laugh, and why. Hecklers were another education. A northern club audience might give a singer a chance to finish a song. A comedian could be challenged before the first joke was finished. Marti learned to respond quickly, sharply, and without losing the room. She could be glamorous and aggressive, warm and dangerous, ridiculous and in command. The contradiction became the act. The club years lasted more than a decade. They were the part of her career later descriptions could compress into a sentence, but they were the reason she looked effortless when television finally arrived. Every difficult audience had taught her something. Every bad room had forced another adjustment. Every evening when the jokes landed had proved that she could do it again. And for most of those years, national television remained somewhere else. That distance matters. When Marti Caine eventually appeared to become an overnight star, the overnight success had already lived several lives. She had been the child sent into care, the teenage bride, the young mother, the woman trying to pay for a funeral, Sunny Smith, Zoe Bond, Marti Caine for a moment, then Marti Caine. By the early 1970s, the name was established around the club circuit, but Britons still did not know it. One television program would change that almost at once. By 1974, Marti Caine had something many performers never acquire, an act that had survived hostile rooms. What she did not yet have was national recognition. Her agent, John Peller, encouraged her to enter New Faces, the ITV talent program that offered professional and semi-professional entertainers a route into national television. The show was not Opportunity Knocks. It had its own culture, its own judges, and its own brutal arithmetic. Performers stood under studio lights while panels awarded scores that could turn years of work into a number in seconds. Marti entered. The irony is difficult to miss. A woman who had spent years being judged in clubs was now voluntarily walking into a television program built around public judgment. But this time, the room was ready for her. Her mixture of comedy, physical awkwardness, and glamour translated perfectly to television. One memorable performance involved a dress she had designed to come apart as she fell dramatically down a staircase. The act looked chaotic. The control behind it was anything but. At one stage of the competition, she received an extraordinary 98 marks out of 100. Then came the 1975 Grand Final at the London Palladium. The field included performers whose names would themselves become part of British entertainment history. A young Lenny Henry was among the finalists. Victoria Wood, another future giant of British comedy and an earlier New Faces success, was also closely associated with the programme and appeared in the same ATV summer entertainment world around that period. The final was close, painfully close. Marti Caine defeated comedian Al Dean by a single point, 1 point. A career that had taken more than a decade to build reached national television, and the official margin separating victory from second place could be counted on one finger. That is one of the strange cruelties and wonders of entertainment. The public later remembers inevitability. In the moment, almost nothing is inevitable. Had the score shifted slightly, Marti would still have been talented. She would still have been battle-hardened. She would still have been funny. But the story of British television might have opened a different door at a different speed. Instead, the door flew open. At 30 years old, Marti Caine became the winner of New Faces. There is a phrase often attached to talent shows. They discover people. In Marti's case, the word is misleading. New Faces did not discover her talent. The club audiences had been testing it for years. What television discovered was that the rest of Britain wanted her too. The transformation was immediate. The northern performer who had been earning modest money in working men's clubs became a nationally recognized face. Television bookings followed. Theatre offers expanded. Cabaret work moved into larger rooms. The years when she could walk through most British towns without being recognized were ending. But fame introduced a new problem. The act that had been built as armor was now the thing the country wanted every night. Marti Caine was louder than Lynn Stringer, brasser, more glamorous, more fearless. The stage personality could attack a heckler, fall downstairs for a laugh, mock her own body, and leave the room convinced that nothing could hurt her. Lynn was more complicated. That division between the public woman and the private one would matter increasingly as the years passed. Fame solved money problems and opened doors, but it did not erase childhood, insecurity, or the fragile structures of family life. For the moment, however, there was little time to think about any of that. Television had finally called, and Marti Caine was about to become one of the most visible women in British light entertainment. Winning new faces did not turn Marti Caine into a different performer. It gave the performer she had already built a much larger room. Television suited her because she contained several forms of entertainment at once. She could tell jokes, sing, dance, act, perform physical comedy, and speak directly to an audience without creating the impression that a script stood between them. The BBC recognized the possibilities quickly. The years immediately after New Faces were a rush of television work. In 1975, she appeared on the Wheel Tappers and Shunters Social Club, a wonderfully appropriate national bridge from the club culture that had trained her. In 1976 came Nobody Does It Like Marty. In 1977, she fronted Marty and also appeared in The Little and Largest Show on Earth. These programs mattered because they showed television producers testing the same question in different forms. Could the woman who had won a talent contest become a durable television star rather than a one-season novelty? The answer was yes. A television special in the late 1970s led into the series most closely associated with her peak years, The Marti Caine Show. From 1979 through 1984, the program gave her the kind of platform few female comedians of that era were trusted to carry. Her own name above the title, her own comedy, her own songs and major guest stars moving through her television world. Across its run, the show welcomed performers from very different corners of entertainment. Barbara Dixon appeared. Peter Skellern appeared. The Drifters shared the program with her. Elaine Paige, Leo Sayer, Kiki Dee, Rita Moreno, The Four Tops, Chris Rea and many others passed through a format built around Marty's ability to move from comedy to music without making either feel like an interruption. The scale of it matters. For a woman who had begun in working men's clubs, the BBC studio represented more than professional success. She was now the person other stars were invited to appear with. Her national status was reinforced by appearances in the Royal Variety Performance in both 1978 and 1979. In 1978, she shared the bill at the London Palladium with a remarkable cross-section of British entertainment, including June Whitfield, John Inman, Paul Daniels, Danny LaRue, and Gracie Fields. The following year, she appeared in the Royal Variety Performance again, this time at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. The woman who had once needed a club booking to pay a funeral bill was now performing in programs staged before the royal family. Yet television comedy could sometimes obscure another of Marty's genuine strengths. She could sing. In 1981, BBC Records released Point of View, a 10-track album that gave her a chance to step away from the novelty expectations that often surrounded comedians who made records. Working with producer Barry Blue, Marti moved through pop, soul, funk, and dark disco with a seriousness that surprised anyone who knew her only as the tall woman making jokes on television. The album did not become a major commercial success. At the time, it largely disappeared. Then, something unexpected happened. Decades later, Point of View developed a cult following among record collectors and DJs. Original copies became difficult to find and were reported selling for more than £200. In 2018, Be With Records gave the album its first officially licensed vinyl reissue, limited to 500 copies. It was a strange second life for a record Marti never lived to see rediscovered. The comedian had been remembered immediately. The singer took longer. That later reappraisal matters because people who saw Marti live often remembered the same thing. The jokes were only part of the act. She could sing, dance, perform physical comedy, and move between them without asking the audience to lower its expectations. Point of view survives as evidence that the musical side of Marti Caine was not simply television decoration. It was another part of the performer. Film offered another direction. In 1981, she appeared as Margaret Moore in Birds of Paradise, a feature comedy made in South Africa. Acting never displaced the public image of Marti Caine the entertainer, but it revealed how unwilling she was to remain inside one professional box. The same instinct appeared in business. With partners, she became involved in establishing health and fitness clubs in the north of England. Contemporary accounts described them partly as an insurance policy, something beyond show business in case the applause ever stopped. That detail says more about Marti than it first appears to. People who have experienced instability rarely trust success completely. No matter how famous she became, part of her remembered what it felt like when there was not enough money. Part of her remembered that television could stop calling. Part of her knew that a life could change with one death, one bill, one failed relationship, or one decision made by somebody else. And her private life was already proving the point. Her marriage to Malcolm Stringer, begun when both were very young, ended in divorce in 1979. Contemporary profiles later described the breakdown as especially painful. The relationship that had existed before Marti Caine was a household name did not survive the years in which she became one. She was earning serious money now. She was famous. She could walk onto a stage and control a room. None of that guaranteed emotional security. There was another insecurity too, one Marti discussed with an unusual lack of vanity. Success had not cured the way she saw herself. She had built a career partly by making jokes about her own appearance, but the jokes grew from genuine sensitivity. She spoke about her nose, her thinness, and the difference between Marti, the glamorous performer, and Lynne, the woman who could go home and do housework without needing an audience. The split was useful professionally. It may also have been exhausting. The public wanted Marti. The family knew Lynne. The performer could be fearless because the private woman did not always feel that way. By the early 1980s, she had reached a level of success that would have seemed impossible when she first entered the clubs. Yet the next major chapter of her career would not be remembered primarily for a television rating, a song, or a joke. It would be remembered for a decision that followed her back to Sheffield and put hundreds of protesters outside a theatre where she was trying to perform one of the greatest roles of her life. Success gives a performer the ability to choose. It also means those choices become public. In the early 1980s, Marti Caine accepted work in South Africa. She had already appeared in the South African-produced film Birds of Paradise, but the engagement that created the lasting controversy was far larger. In August 1982, Marti became the star of an elaborate production called Voila at Sun City in Bophuthatswana. The name alone requires historical context. Bophuthatswana was one of the so-called homelands created under apartheid. South Africa's government presented such territories as nominally independent entities, but they formed part of the wider system of racial separation that denied political rights and freedom to the black majority. Sun City became internationally famous as a luxury resort and entertainment complex. It also became a political symbol. For performers, appearing there was increasingly controversial because anti-apartheid campaigners argued that international entertainment helped normalize a system the cultural boycott was designed to isolate. Marti's production was no minor booking. Contemporary reporting described Voila as a multi-million-dollar show built around her, with roughly 17 months devoted to rehearsal and performance. She did not return to Britain apologizing for the experience. She defended the people she had met and resisted pressure to sign a pledge never to work in South Africa again. In October 1983, the United Nations included her name on its register of performers who had appeared in South Africa. Other major entertainers appeared on that list too, but collective company did not reduce the controversy. For Marti, the confrontation became especially painful because it followed her home. In 1984, she accepted the title role in Funny Girl at Sheffield's Crucible Theatre. The casting was almost unnervingly appropriate. Fanny Brice had risen from poverty and comic insecurity to become a star of the Ziegfeld Follies. Marti Caine had risen from Sheffield hardship and working men's clubs to become one of Britain's best-known entertainers. Both women built comedy partly from appearance, ambition, and the tension between private pain and public confidence. But when Funny Girl opened, the drama was not confined to the stage. More than 500 anti-apartheid protesters gathered outside the Crucible. Theatre employees had signed a petition. Campaigners objected not to Marti's comic talent or to her right to perform, but to her Sun City engagement and her refusal to support the boycott. Inside the theatre, Marti was attempting one of the most demanding musical roles of her career. Outside, demonstrators were challenging one of the most controversial decisions she had ever made. It would be easy, decades later, to simplify the moment into a morality play. The historical reality deserves more care. Apartheid was a system of racial oppression. The cultural boycott became an important part of international pressure against it. Marti's choice to work at Sun City and her public defense of aspects of the experience were therefore deeply controversial and were condemned by anti-apartheid campaigners. At the same time, people working with her at the Crucible described a talented, hard-working performer rather than a political ideologue. The theatre's artistic leadership maintained that Marti opposed apartheid but did not accept the boycott as campaigners wanted her to. The distinction did little to calm the controversy, but Marti did not retreat from work. Instead, Funny Girl revealed an acting and musical range that club comedy alone could never fully show. Her Fanny Brice was more than a television personality attempting a famous role. Marti understood something of the character's journey from insecurity and hardship to fame, because elements of that journey echoed her own. The production also brought her into the orbit of director Claire Venables, whose serious theatrical approach pushed Marti beyond the safest version of her public persona. By the mid-1980s, she was no longer simply protecting the fame she had won on New Faces. She was trying to prove how much more she could do. 1984 became one of the most revealing years of Marti Caine's career. She was controversial enough to attract protesters, established enough to headline Funny Girl, and ambitious enough to move directly into another form of television work. The BBC sitcom Hilary gave her a sustained acting role rather than a variety show version of herself. Marti played Hilary Myers, a divorced mother with a 19-year-old son who worked as a researcher on a television chat show. The pilot was broadcast in December 1984, and the character continued through 2 series. Across 12 episodes, Marti worked alongside performers including Philip Maddock, Jack Smethurst, and Carolyn Moody. The importance of Hilary is easy to miss if her career is remembered only through New Faces and her own variety show. It proved that the Marti Caine persona was not the only thing television could use. She could play a character, carry a sitcom, and work inside an ensemble where the joke did not always depend on the audience recognizing the real woman behind it. That same period brought a major change in her private life. In 1984, Marti married director Kenneth Ives. The relationship would endure through the most difficult years still waiting ahead. By then, she was no longer the 17-year-old girl marrying as an escape route from a damaged childhood. She was an internationally experienced performer with money, fame, adult sons, and a professional identity of her own. She also had the confidence to enter social and theatrical circles far removed from the Sheffield club world where she had begun. Not that the old Marti disappeared. One obituary later recalled her magnificent ability to puncture grand occasions accidentally. At a gathering, she once asked the celebrated theatre director Peter Hall what he did for a living. On another occasion, she was introduced to an elderly man and asked, in effect, "Larry who?" The answer was, "Laurence Olivier." The anecdote survived because they captured something essential. Fame had changed Marti Caine's circumstances without fully teaching her to behave like somebody who believed in hierarchy. Then, in 1986, came one of the most satisfying reversals in her career. New faces returned. So did Marti. But she was no longer the contestant. Central Television revived the program and chose the woman who had won it 11 years earlier as host. From 1986 through 1988, Marti Caine stood at the center of the same basic machinery that had once measured her future in judges' marks. Now she introduced the acts. Now she talked to the contestants. Now she told the panel when it was time to press the buttons. And because she remembered what it felt like to stand on the other side, she could be fiercely protective of performers when criticism became unnecessarily cruel. Her on-screen clashes with Judge Nina Maiskau became part of the revived program's personality. Yet accounts from those years also make clear that television conflict did not necessarily equal private hostility. Off-camera, the two women could be friends. That distinction was pure show business, and Marti understood it better than most. The revived New Faces ran for 3 series with Marti as presenter, introducing another generation of entertainers. The woman once judged by the program had become its emotional center. There is a powerful symmetry in that. But history has another symmetry waiting. The program returned in 1986. Within roughly 2 years, Marti would be facing a form of judgment no panel could soften and no audience vote could reverse. Her body was about to deliver a result she had not auditioned for. Marti Caine had spent most of her life being frightened of things and then behaving as though she was not. The strategy had worked on club audiences, television studios, critics, and professional failure. Cancer was different. Contemporary accounts place the decisive diagnosis in 1988, when a Harley Street doctor told Marti that she had a malignant lymphoma, later described as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The language was medical. The meaning was brutally simple. She was seriously ill. The instinctive response was a joke. Marti asked whether having lymphoma made her a lymphomaniac. It is one of the lines most often repeated from the final chapter of her life, because it sounds like a perfect example of courage. Marti herself was less comfortable with that word. Courage implies an absence of surrender. It can also imply an absence of fear. Marti knew fear intimately. Treatment for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was exhausting. Chemotherapy attacked the disease while punishing the body carrying it. Her hair fell out. Energy disappeared. The performer who had built a career on appearance, movement, and command of the stage was forced into a new relationship with a body that no longer obeyed the old rules. Even the loss of her hair became material. She later joked about the cold and the absurdity of sleeping in a woolly hat. But the joke did not make treatment painless. Kenneth Ives remained beside her. The second marriage, formed after the turbulence of earlier decades, became the partnership within which she fought the disease. Marti researched her illness obsessively. She wanted information, not comforting vagueness. She asked questions about treatment and prognosis. She believed that understanding what was happening gave her some control over a process designed to make a patient feel powerless. At one stage, the outlook was described as extremely poor. She kept working. That choice should not be romanticized into a claim that work defeated cancer. It did not. What work did was protect something the cancer could not be allowed to define. Marti Caine was a performer before the diagnosis. She intended to remain one after it. Within the struggle, there were periods of improvement and remission. There were also relapses. The pattern stretched across years rather than the short future initially feared. Those additional years became part of her public story. At a time when many celebrities kept cancer hidden behind carefully worded statements, Marti spoke about it. She discussed treatment. She discussed fear. She made jokes that were sometimes startling because the subject was death and the person making the joke was the one under threat. Then she did something even more revealing. She wrote it down. In 1990, A Coward's Chronicles was published. The title rejected the heroic image other people were constructing around her. The book mixed autobiography with the record of cancer treatment, allowing the frightened woman and the famous comedian to occupy the same pages. She called herself a coward, not because she had surrendered, but because she refused the idea that survival required fearlessness. The book forced readers to reconsider the television personality. The glamorous clown had a serious voice. The woman who joked about her body had spent years carrying memories of childhood abuse. The comic who seemed to convert everything into entertainment could also describe what happened when the material stopped being funny. A Coward's Chronicles became one of the most important artifacts of Marti Caine's career because it gave Lynne permission to speak without Marti constantly interrupting with a punchline. And yet Marti never disappeared. She still wanted the stage. 2 years after being told she was dying, contemporary reports noted that she was appearing in pantomime in Bath. She became closely associated with the Red Queen in Snow White, performing the part in several British venues over the years. The woman whose hair had fallen out during chemotherapy was still walking into theatres and asking audiences to look at her. That is not the absence of fear, it is performance in the presence of it. By the beginning of the 1990s, Marti Caine had already shown that cancer would not be allowed to close her career quietly. In March 1991, she returned to Desert Island Discs for the second time, 12 years after her first appearance. The contrast was stark. In 1979, she had been a television star whose future still seemed wide open. Now she was famous, successful, and living with cancer. The program looked back across the difficult childhood, the collapse of her first marriage, and the illness that had changed the shape of her life. Yet Marti still found room for the unexpected. Among the 8 recordings she chose for the island was the BBC Radio 4 shipping forecast, not a conventional song at all, but a weather bulletin. It was an eccentric choice, unmistakably British and completely in character. Even when invited to look seriously at her own life, Marti could still find the absurd angle nobody else would have chosen. Her television career also continued. In 1992, she presented the BBC One series Joker in the Pack, followed in 1993 by Your Best Shot. Neither program became the defining achievement of her career, but their dates matter. These were not old recordings being repeated while Marti withdrew from public life. They were new credits being added after a devastating diagnosis. Then, on the 30th of November, 1994, she became the subject of This Is Your Life. The Red Book could now move through almost the entire journey, from Sheffield and the working men's clubs to new faces, television stardom, family life, and cancer. The uncomfortable truth behind the celebration was that this was not yet a retrospective on a finished career. Marti was still working, and she was still ill. One more significant television appearance followed. On the 8th of May, 1995, Britain marked the 50th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day with Call Up the Stars, a program in which contemporary performers recreated the styles of wartime entertainers. Marti appeared as Gracie Fields. There was a neat historical circle in the casting. When Marti had appeared in the Royal Variety performance in 1978, Gracie Fields herself had made a celebrated return to the London Palladium. 17 years later, Marti was portraying the older Northern star for another generation of viewers. By then, however, her health was deteriorating again. A relapse eventually forced her to withdraw from a planned Christmas pantomime in Basingstoke, where she had been due to play the Red Queen in Snow White. For a woman whose working life had once paid debts, supported her family, created the name Marti Caine, and carried her through years of treatment, cancelling work marked something more serious than a change of schedule. The final decline came quickly. In early November 1995, Marti was in hospital but wanted to go home. On Friday the 3rd of November, she discharged herself and returned to Oxfordshire. Kenneth Ives was beside her. Her condition deteriorated rapidly following a reaction to treatment for lymphoma, and on Saturday the 4th of November, 1995, Marti Caine died at her home in Henley-on-Thames. She was 50 years old. The number matters because the woman preserved on television appears permanently energetic, glamorous, and quick. Old recordings can make her seem untouched by time, but the real Marti never reached 51. She never became the elderly veteran invited back to discuss the television world she had helped shape. Her career did not reach a natural final curtain. it was interrupted while new work was still appearing, and while there was every reason to imagine more could have followed. The distinction between Lynne and Marti was never as simple as one being real and the other invented. Marti Caine was the version of herself that could walk into hostile rooms, turn insecurity into material, and make an audience laugh before anyone else could decide where the joke belonged. Even after fame arrived, traces of the outsider remained. One obituary recalled her asking the celebrated theatre director Peter Hall what he did for a living. Another famous story involved failing at first to recognize Laurence Olivier. She could move in the same world as Olivier and John Gielgud without ever completely adopting the reverence show business often reserves for its own hierarchy. That outsider quality was also connected to genuine insecurity. Marti had undergone a nose operation and spoke openly about the effect her appearance had on her confidence. The tall, thin body that became part of her visual identity was both a comic instrument and a private sensitivity. Her self-deprecation therefore worked as something more deliberate than simply laughing at herself. In the working men's clubs, if somebody else mocked the glamorous woman on stage, they controlled the joke. If Marti reached it first and made it funnier, the power changed hands. That instinct helped her survive a male-dominated circuit and later helped make her one of the relatively few women of her generation trusted to carry major television entertainment in her own name. Near the end of her life, the public often described Marti Caine as brave. Her own autobiography had chosen a very different word: coward. The contrast may explain her better than any polished tribute could. The audience saw the performance of courage. Lynne knew how much fear had been required to produce it. Marti Caine's death produced genuine public grief, but the story returned most visibly to Sheffield. Her funeral was held in the city that had given her both her earliest hardships and the audiences on which she learned her profession. Sheffield did not leave the remembrance inside the cathedral. The sculpture that would become associated with Marti had not originally been conceived as a memorial to her. Commissioned by Sheffield Hallam University as part of the 1995 Stone City project, it was a work Marti herself had been expected to unveil. But she died only weeks before the opening. Instead, the sculpture was dedicated to her memory. On Monday, the 20th of November 1995, Kenneth Ives unveiled it in her place at the corner of Howard Street and Arundel Gate. It was called Sheen, created by sculptor Mick Farrell, the 2-meter, 3-ton work-combined stone with polished stainless steel designed to catch and reflect changing light. It was an abstract modernist sculpture rather than a portrait of Marti, but the circumstances transformed it into something far more personal. She had been expected to stand beside it as a guest. Instead, only weeks after her death, her husband stood there and unveiled it as a tribute to her. The same day carried another honour. Kenneth Ives received a posthumous degree on Marti's behalf from Sheffield Hallam University, which lists her among its 1995 honorary award recipients. For somebody who had begun with no obvious route into entertainment, it was a striking final return. The city where Lynne Shepherd had once been an unknown working-class girl was now preserving Marti Caine in public space and formally recognizing the career she had built. Her legacy does not require every decision to be defended or every period of her life to be made comfortable. The Sun City controversy remains part of the record, just as the New Faces victory, her BBC shows, theatre work and years of illness do. What makes the career unusual is the distance travelled between its beginning and its end. She entered show business through working men's clubs because she needed money, then eventually returned to New Faces as the person presenting the programme that had once judged her. She became one of the relatively small number of female entertainers of her generation whose name alone could carry a major television series, and she continued adding work to that career while cancer was already limiting the time available to her. That is why her death at 50 feels less like the closing of a completed career than an interruption. Had Marti lived into her 70s or 80s, there would almost certainly have been other versions of her. The veteran presenter, the memoirist, the returning comic, perhaps the judge or interviewer looking back on the entertainment world she had survived. None of those years arrived. What remains instead is the archive, and in it, Marti Caine never becomes old. She remains the performer who learned to turn vulnerability into authority and fear into laughter, right up to the point when time finally denied her another act. Marti Caine called her autobiography A Coward's Chronicles. Perhaps that was the final joke. Other people saw a woman who survived brutal club audiences, television judgment, public controversy, and years of cancer treatment, and called her courageous. Marti knew that courage had never meant the absence of fear. It meant continuing while fear remained. Lynne Denise Shepherd was born in Sheffield on the 26th of January 1945. Marti Caine was created years later in the clubs, almost by accident, and eventually became one of the most recognizable women in British entertainment. On the 4th of November 1995, both stories ended in Henley-on-Thames at the age of 50. The life had been short. The distance travelled inside it had not. The person disappeared. The performances remained. And the laughter did not. This has been Cinema Peak. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider subscribing for more stories from the lives, triumphs, and hidden histories of Britain's unforgettable screen and stage legends. Thank you for watching.